So Judge Moro, who I'll talk about more extensively in this commentary, resigned yesterday. And the core of the conflict is essentially that Jair Bolsonaro was planning to, and it had been announced that he was going to fire the head of the federal police in Brazil, which is essentially Brazil's equivalent of the FBI. And Moro objected to this, and when we got down to it, it looked like Bolsonaro was concerned that the head of the FBI, this is Moro you're seeing now, was interested in investigating people around Bolsonaro, including his sons. One of the most persistent and serious stories around the Bolsonaro administration from the beginning is that they are connected to genuine fascistic forces as well as Rio de Janeiro-based paramilitaries, including the ones who assassinated Marielle Franco, who was an incredibly courageous city councilwoman in Rio who worked against police violence and for justice and development in Rio. She was assassinated, and her driver was murdered as well, execution style, in 2018. And there's a lot of evidence, at least, that it connects some of the gunmen to Bolsonaro's family. And there's also some accusations that some of the recent protests, which have explicitly called for shutting down the Brazilian Congress and kind of formally ending democracy, have relationships with Bolsonaro's sons. Now, Sergio Moro came out this morning and said, look, there's a lot of issues happening with Bolsonaro. He implied that there's a lot of corruption situations, and he even mentioned, while attacking the Workers' Party, which we'll get to in a minute, that's the only reason why we're even talking about Sergio Moro or Bolsonaro as president, this very important history we have to re-review, that Sergio Moro said that when he was investigating the Workers' Party as part of Lava Jato, Dilma Rousseff, the then Brazilian president, never interfered in his investigation, even as it was tackling the Workers' Party, but yet as Justice Minister, Bolsonaro was sort of interfering on his turf. And again, it should be remind everybody that Moro was basically trying to also at the same time push through Bolsonaro's domestic agenda, which literally would make it easier in already a country with massive police and paramilitary violence for police to kill youths and people of color in favelas. And I'll elaborate on why nobody should sympathize with Moro in a minute. Bolsonaro hit back. He did a deranged press conference yesterday. This is, of course, in the middle of saying that people should be back out in the streets, forget the quarantine. He just fired his own health minister. Bolsonaro basically said that Moro was an egotist, somebody not committed to a broader project. All of these things absolutely track with Moro, but why Bolsonaro would allow himself to reveal potential crimes to somebody that he himself understands as a careerist egotist is another kind of sign of Bolsonaro's stupidity and incompetence. We see a split here inside the coalition that has brought Bolsonaro to power, and it might have implication for right-wing parties generally. There is a part of the Bolsonaro coalition that can genuinely be called fascistic. I think there's absolutely a part of the Trump coalition that can genuinely be called fascistic. These people are through and through authoritarians who basically want to get rid of even limited formal democracy, especially in Brazil, where literally the phrase neo-fascism was coined to describe the Brazilian military dictatorship in the 70s. Then there's also in the Bolsonaro coalition some real elements of the sort of Lula would have won voters, which I'll get to in a second. These are kind of petite bourgeoisie, people who might, as an example, be fruit sellers on the street of Sao Paulo. They might have some very reactionary politics, but they also could be persuaded and appealed to on other economic issues, as an example. The Moro coalition is a bunch of upper middle class people connected to the neoliberalization project of Brazil, to privatize, slash the social safety net, and with huge sort of class identity politics and social resentment from the top down. These people voted for Bolsonaro overwhelmingly, but they might be a little bit embarrassed by how much of an idiot Bolsonaro is and how much he's embarrassing them internationally. Sergio Moro is a god for these people. And let's be clear about who Sergio Moro is, because he got an incredible amount of positive coverage in the United States. Just yesterday, Kenneth Roth, the head of Human Rights Watch, called him Bolsonaro's respected justice minister. Well, let's be clear about what Sergio Moro did with the whole Lava Jato operation. Lava Jato was an independent task force with strong U.S. backing that began as an independent task force to investigate corruption in Brazil and quickly essentially became the political arm of the Brazilian right and U.S. foreign policy to go after the Workers' Party and former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. This had an enormous amount of implications out of the gate, including hundreds of thousands of people losing their jobs at state construction companies, as well as attacks on Petrobras and the national oil company, which had major implications for the Brazilian economy. In 2018, former President Lula, who during his time in office lifted about 30 million people out of poverty, led Bolsonaro in the polls. And this is really important here, because when we talk about these lists of these obscene leaders that are in power, Trump and Bolsonaro and Modi and all the rest, we have to look at the deeper structural neoliberalism that led to the rise of these people. And in the Brazil case, you cannot in any way separate an aggressive Obama administration policy, which went after center-left pink tide governments across Latin America. So in 2018, Lula was leading by double digits in the polls. This process undertaken by Lava Jato was sped up. Lula was put in jail, and we all know, thanks to Intercept releases, disclosures, that the Lava Jato operation was politicized, that had a personal hatred of Lula, and the prosecutors themselves questioned their own case that they put Lula in jail for, literally the taking of renovations in a condo that it was never even proven that he lived in. After the revelations in 2019, the Brazilian Supreme Court finally allowed Lula out, although he still is in legal jeopardy, even as this whole process has been proven to be a sham. This is the project of Sergio Moro, who is still worshipped by the Brazilian upper middle class and given positive treatment in the Western media. Let's play a quick clip of President Lula when he addressed his supporters after being released from prison last fall.
I have no idea of the significance for me to be here with you. I, who my whole life talked with the Brazilian people, never thought that today I could be here talking with men and women who during the past 580 days were here saying good morning Lula, good afternoon Lula, and yelling good night Lula, no matter if it were raining, if it were 40 degrees or 0 degrees.
That was President Lula. So let's just be very clear here. This guy, Sergio Moro, was rewarded for a political operation by a neo-fascist buffoon. The president that they put in jail was internationally respected and successful, and was ultimately targeted because of class resentments and dynamics in Brazil, and also because even though they followed a relatively moderate course, they were unwilling to privatize key geostrategic Brazilian industries, which they used the profits from to invest in people and relieve poverty in Brazil. And this caused the United States to oppose him and the Workers' Party. We're not here today with any of these leaders because of random accidents or people being uninformed or the bad democratic practices of various people. There's always a context for the rise of even the most obscene leaders. And as Brazil comes apart in their right wing, hopefully that will go along and lead to a failure of Bolsonaro without a return of military leadership in Brazil, which is a potential problem. And also we can learn from actual effective center-left government in places like the United States and elsewhere as a real alternative to take the world outside of, let's say, clown fascism.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, I've personally learned so much about what's happening in Brazil through you talking about it. And I think one thing that we should be hyper aware of is how certain issues that people on the left actually do care a lot about, like corruption, can be cited and used by dishonest actors to destroy the candidacy or the political careers of good politicians, of people who actually do want to look out for working people. And so what's incredible about these updates to what's happening between Bolsonaro and Moro is how the media is reporting it as, Moro's concerned about some possible corruption taking place right now in Bolsonaro's presidency, which I think is so incredible because Moro is the one who, you're absolutely right, he's part of that neoliberal project, which unfairly and inaccurately ended up imprisoning Lula. And by the way, he wasn't imprisoned on corruption. So it is, I want to read this one quick excerpt from BBC's reporting on this. Mr. Moro is a popular figure in Brazil. He's the former judge who oversaw the country's biggest anti-corruption probe, which uncovered billions of dollars of bribes and led to the convictions of dozens of high-profile business leaders and politicians. So he's painted as, this warrior for, rooting out corruption and injustice, when in reality, he's the person who wants to protect that.
Yeah, I just real quick, you're 100% right. And I think that just two things are important to point out. One is that just even by limited parameters that the BBC and other media outlets in the West could still report it like that after he takes the job of justice minister, after he puts Lula in jail, is astonishing. Like, that does not take any analysis to figure out. If, look, maybe Joe Biden should be in jail, okay? But if Donald Trump had a prosecutor somewhere throw Joe Biden in jail and then that person was awarded with attorney general, that would not be in any way complicated what the innate problems with that were. And I think secondly, with regards to the corruption, it's very important to really distinguish, particularly when you consider the history of Western interventionism and coups and ongoing hybrid warfare that exists to this day. I mean, we just had a coup in Bolivia. I no doubt had a U.S. role. The war against the government in Venezuela. It doesn't mean that you can't criticize or have a fully integrated approach to these places. But at the same time, particularly when somebody like Lula comes along and says, look, I understand that there is structural corruption in the Brazilian governing class, and this is the way business is done here, and I'm going to get into power and eliminate poverty in this country. If that is just reported as corruption, that's profoundly dishonest and misleading. It is a radically different thing for somebody to take power and work within the parameters of a system, versus have chateaus in Switzerland with stolen state money. Those are more of the sort of U.S. client leaders that do stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an intentional effort to decontextualize the situation in Brazil and in other countries. So I've been thinking a lot about what happened in Bolivia, what continues to happen in Bolivia. It's devastating. But, what was cited for that coup? Oh, undemocratic practices. But we just had elections in Wisconsin in the middle of a pandemic where people are afraid to go out and vote. So does that mean that because of our undemocratic practices, countries can get together and decide we're gonna orchestrate a coup in the United States? I mean, it's incredible how we go around, policing the world and accusing other countries of doing the very same things that we're doing every single day. And it's just something to keep in mind, whenever you hear the type of reporting that we've seen in regard to Brazil, in regard to Bolivia, in regard to Venezuela, you need to be able to, yes, be critical of certain things that happen in these countries, because to pretend like they're all good and there's nothing bad going on, I think is wrong. But at the same time, we need to also focus on how certain things we do care about, like corruption, for instance, or undemocratic practices, are things that we're guilty of ourselves, but we cite those very issues as excuses for overthrowing democratically elected leaders.
Absolutely. And just to be really clear before we go to our break too, that, the Bolivia reporting in Bolivia is that, in fact, Morales won that race. I mean, there is no credible, and it was asserted by the usual right-wing subjects, but people, but plenty of liberal people, without any evidence out of the gate that election was somehow illegitimate. It was not. And even the Washington Post reported, of course, months after they helped cheerlead that on, that in fact that was a coup. Morales had won the race, and we need to watch these things very carefully. A similar process we'll talk about later is starting to take shape in Mexico.